mentioned on day one how all the major powers in Europe had treaties with one another so that in the event of one side or the other being invaded, the other side would automatically go and help. They also had mobilization plans. And what that meant was that in the event of a war, it was the plan by which they'd mobilize all their troops, including the reservists, get them to the border, ready to then cross and head off to attack the enemy's country. The Germans had a unique problem. They had got themselves into a situation where the French on one side and the Russians on the other had a pact, which meant the Germans were effectively encircled. So they needed to come up with a plan to deal with these two large armies pretty much at the same time if they could, or if not, immediately one after the other. So the solution was a plan devised by Count Schlieffen, the Schlieffen Plan. And what that meant was that the Germans would mobilize, they'd cut through the corner of Luxembourg, through Belgium, violating its neutrality that pretty much everyone, including Germany, had signed and agreed to, and then carry on through France, encircle Paris, go round behind Paris, and then come in behind the French armies that they knew would be attacking into Germany in Alsace and Lorraine, which were the two French provinces that the Germans had taken from the French in the 1870s after the Franco-Prussian War. So that was the idea: deal with the French would be beaten, sue for peace, and then they could go and deal with the Russians, who they were assuming would mobilize a lot slower than the French. In the years after Schlieffen came up with his plan, other German officers tinkered with the plan, altered it, slightly weakened it, beefed up the defences on the Eastern Front against the Russians, which wasn't a bad thing. The Russians actually mobilised much quicker than the Germans thought they were going to. But what it meant was there were less Germans to travel in this big arc around the back of Paris. When it actually happened, as the German army comes through Belgium towards France, they get held up at the French forts, the big defensive positions. Eventually they were smashed up by big German artillery pieces, so they weren't slowed up for very long. The advance then continues into France, and then the Germans bump into the British Expeditionary Force at Mons and then Le Cateau. And even though the Germans aren't beaten by any means, the British do give them a bloody nose and stop them in their tracks. And at that point, instead of ignoring this tiny little British Expeditionary Force, which was then retreating down towards the River Marne, the Germans decided to stop this big encircling movement around Paris and follow the British. So they start chasing them down towards the southwest, towards the River Marne, to the east of Paris. In the meantime, the French have appointed 65-year-old retired General Joseph Gallieni as the military governor of Paris. He hasn't got much in the way of troops because General Joffre has taken most of them for the fighting, but he starts making preparations. He starts cutting down trees to give clear sightlines for artillery. They wire up the Eiffel Tower for demolition. It's that sort of thing. And then on the 2nd of September 1914, the national government of France decide that the war's getting a bit close, and really the sensible thing to do would be to move out of Paris and head over to the west out of the way. So they leave Paris on the 2nd, and on the 3rd, Gallieni issues this proclamation. And as you can see, it's headed Military Government of Paris, and it's addressed to the Army of Paris and the inhabitants of Paris. And it says, "The members of the government of the Republic have left Paris to give a new impulse to the national defence. I have received the mandate to defend Paris against the invader. The mandate I shall carry out to the end." Dated Paris, 3rd of September 1914, and signed Military Governor of Paris, commanding the Army of Paris, Gallieni. Luckily, all that defensive work that they'd been doing around Paris proved unnecessary, because the decision by the Germans to stop the encircling movement around Paris and to chase the British army down on the east side of Paris straight down towards the River Marne suddenly gave an opportunity to the French. Because what it meant was, as the Germans were travelling past Paris, they would leave an exposed flank facing Paris, which meant that the French had the opportunity to attack them in the side, where they were much weaker. By this time, Gallieni had command of the remains of Manoury's 6th Army, and he also had the garrison of Paris. So Manoury's 6th Army were already near the front line, and the garrison of Paris needed transport to get there. So Gallieni gathers up all the taxis in Paris, And over the night of the 6th and the 7th of September, the garrison of Paris are put into taxis and sent off to the front line, which was quite an extraordinary thing to do for its day. Plenty of those soldiers had never been in a car, let alone have a lengthy taxi journey instead of walking everywhere or marching in their army careers. So the troops reach the front line, they attack the Germans successfully, and despite the fact that what was known as the taxi cab army is a very famous piece of First World War history and folklore, in reality, most of the 5,000 troops who travel to the front by taxi end up just being reserves and don't get used at all. But the rest of the troops who were in the front line, they certainly stopped the Germans in their tracks, and they're also attacked from the River Marne by the French and the British, and that's pretty much where Schlieffen's plan finally comes to an end. After that, it's the race up to the sea, there's the battles of the Aisne on the way, and eventually everything settles down into trench warfare and the first Battle of Ypres before Christmas. I think that the one thing that always amazes me is not that people saved things like this poster, because at the time it would have been a big deal. Somebody would have said, that's a real moment. That's a moment when the French government have left Paris. And the day they left was the anniversary of the Battle of Sedan, which during the Franco-Prussian War, when it hadn't gone well for France then either. So it was quite a symbolic day. So you could see why somebody would take that off the wall, fold it up, put it in their pocket and keep it as a souvenir. But for something so flimsy, so throwaway, for something which was just a notice which was designed to last a couple of days and just let everybody know what was going on, to still find it intact, even if it's a bit battered, 110 years later, and help us tell this story, is quite remarkable.